It's the middle of January, and everything above the ground is dead. The soil is frozen 2 inches down. The wind is cutting sideways across an empty garden bed. And somewhere in the Midwest, a gardener named Gary Holbrook is kneeling next to a hole in the ground, pulling back a cover, and looking at something that shouldn't be possible. Kale, spinach, lettuce, alive, green, growing. No power cord running to that hole, no propane heater humming inside it, no electric bill climbing every time the temperature drops. Just dirt, glass, and sunlight. Doing something Gary spent 2 years and a few $100s trying and failing to do above ground. So here's the question worth sitting with for the next few minutes. If the ground can already do this on its own, why do so many of us spend so much money trying to fight winter instead of working with it? Before we get into how Gary pulled this off, hit subscribe, because we're about to walk through exactly what he did, what he got wrong the first time, and the one detail that made the difference between plants that survived and plants that didn't. Gary wasn't new to this. He had raised beds, he had greenhouse plastic stretched over hoops. He had a space heater and a couple of grow lights he'd picked up specifically to push his growing season further into the cold months. He wasn't lazy, and he wasn't careless. He just believed what most of us believe, that if you want to grow something through a real winter, you need to pump heat into a structure and keep it there. That belief cost him. The winter before, a hard freeze rolled through 2 nights in a row, and by the second morning his greenhouse plastic was frosted on the inside and every plant in there was black and limp. The heater had been running. It just couldn't keep up. A lot of gardeners have been exactly where Gary was that morning, standing in front of a dead crop, wondering what the point of all that equipment even was. That's usually where people either give up on winter growing altogether, or they double down and buy something bigger. Gary did neither. He started asking a different question. Not how do I add more heat, but why does the heat keep disappearing so fast in the first place? And that question is what led him to something an older neighbor mentioned almost in passing. A way some growers, including families in Amish communities not far from him, have handled cold weather for generations without any power source at all. Not a secret formula, not some hidden invention modern science overlooked, just a different way of thinking about where you put your plants. Instead of building up, you go down. Here's the part most people miss about a regular greenhouse. Thin plastic or thin glass has almost no ability to hold heat once the sun goes down. During the day, sunlight comes in and warms the air inside. But that warm air sits right next to a wall that's only a few degrees away from the freezing air outside. As soon as the sun sets, that heat leaks right back out, and by 3 in the morning, the inside of that greenhouse is almost as cold as the yard around it. Gary's heater wasn't failing because it was a bad heater. It was failing because it was fighting a losing battle against a structure that couldn't hold on to anything it was given. The ground doesn't have that problem. Go down a few feet, and the soil holds a much steadier temperature than the air ever does, generally somewhere in the 50 to 60 degree range, depending on your region, your soil type, and how deep you go. That's not a heater. That's stored warmth, built up slowly over the warmer months and released slowly through the cold ones. The same way a battery holds a charge and releases it a little at a time instead of all at once. Gary wasn't going to outheat winter. He was going to borrow warmth the ground had already been storing since summer. So he picked a spot. Not randomly. He spent a full day watching where the winter sun actually hit his property, because a shaded yard was never going to work no matter how deep he dug. Then he started digging down several feet, right into that steadier layer of soil. Now here's an honesty interruption, because this is where a lot of people get into trouble. The exact temperature you'll find underground isn't the same everywhere. Your climate, your soil moisture, and your region all change the number. Someone in Minnesota and someone in Georgia are not going to get identical results from identical holes. This method gives you an advantage. It doesn't hand you a guarantee. Something interesting happened once Gary started digging. He didn't haul the dirt away. He piled it up along the north side of the pit, and that dirt wall ended up doing 2 jobs at once, blocking the coldest winter wind from hitting the growing space and giving him something solid to angle his cover against. The material he was removing from the hole became part of the structure protecting it. That's not a trick. That's just not wasting what you already have. But before he planted a single seed, Gary tested something most first-timers skip completely: drainage. He dug a smaller test hole nearby and watched how fast water moved through it. This matters more than people expect, because an underground growing space in soil that doesn't drain well isn't a greenhouse, it's a bathtub. And a flooded pit will rot roots and collapse walls a lot faster than any frost ever could. Site selection, it turns out, mattered more than anything Gary was going to buy. For the cover, Gary used a salvaged window he'd pulled out of a garage cleanout, and he angled it toward the south, toward where the low winter sun actually travels across the sky. This is the detail that trips a lot of people up. A cousin of his tried something similar the year before and laid his cover almost flat, like a lid on a pot. It failed. Not because the depth was wrong, but because a flat cover doesn't let low winter sunlight reach the back of a pit. The angle has to work with the sun's actual path, and that path is different depending on where you live. Once Gary got that angle right, sunlight reached all the way to the back wall of his growing space, and that's when things actually started working. And here's where we need to talk about the number in the title, because I'm not going to pretend it applies to everyone. Gary's setup used a salvaged window, reclaimed lumber, tools he already owned, and soil that was already on his property. That's how you land anywhere close to $20. If you're starting from zero, buying glazing, buying lumber, renting equipment to dig, your cost is going to be a lot higher than that, and depending on your yard, it might not be a small project at all. The $20 version is real, but it assumes you're working with what you can find, not what you can buy. What was Gary actually growing down there? Not tomatoes, not peppers, nothing tropical, and nothing that needed warm nights to thrive. Kale, spinach, cold hardy lettuce. Plants that are built to tolerate cool, stable conditions rather than heat. And that's really the honest promise of this whole approach. It's not about pulling a summer garden out of a snowbank. Sometimes the real win is just keeping something alive through the coldest months, harvesting a little at a time, and getting a head start once spring finally shows up. The routine wasn't automatic either, and this is something worth being straight about. Every morning, Gary uncovered the glazing to let sunlight in. Every evening, before the temperature dropped, he covered it again with insulation to hold what warmth had built up during the day. Passive growing doesn't mean no work, it means different work. Less about fighting the cold every hour, and more about paying attention twice a day. Then came the twist Gary didn't expect. It wasn't a freezing night that almost cost him a crop, it was a sunny afternoon. On a clear day, even with snow on the ground outside, sunlight hitting that glazing built up heat fast, and without airflow, that pit turned muggy and warm enough to stress the plants and invite mildew. Gary had been so focused on keeping the cold out that he almost lost his greens to the exact opposite problem. The fix was simple, a small vent to let air move, but the lesson underneath it was bigger. The goal was never maximum heat. The goal was stability. Too cold damages plants. Too hot stresses them. Too much moisture rots them. A good grower isn't the person who builds the structure and walks away. It's the person who learns to read it. Which brings us back to that January morning we started with. Gary walks out to the pit, pulls back the cover, and checks the thermometer. No dramatic reaction. No shouting, just a quiet look at the number and a quiet look at plants that are still very much alive. Somewhere underneath his boots, the ground had been doing part of the work the entire time, and all he'd really done was stop working against it. Gary doesn't tell people he beat winter. He didn't. He just stopped fighting it head-on and started cooperating with what the land was already offering him. Sunlight that falls in a predictable place, soil that holds its own quiet warmth, wind that a simple dirt wall can block, and materials that were sitting around unused before he gave them a job to do. That's the actual secret, if you want to call it that. Not a hidden trick, just paying closer attention to what you already have before reaching for something new. If you've got a winter coming and a backyard you've never really studied for sun and drainage, that's where to start. Not with a shopping list, but with a walk around your own property. So tell me, what's the coldest month you've ever managed to harvest something fresh out of your own yard? If you want to see what other forgotten growing methods are still worth using today, subscribe, because that's exactly where we're headed next.